It was 1908, and mankind was on the verge of marvelous things. Powered flight was a reality, but the world was still trying to come to grips with its potential. And in Berkeley, California, the limits of power flight were being tested, with the magnificent Morrell Airship about to redefine the public's perception of aviation. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
John A. Morrell was a man with a vision. To that end, in 1905, an advertisement wrote, several members of the International Aero Club incorporated the National Airship Company for the purpose of aiding the progress of civilization and enriching whoever would invest in the stock. In a 1907 prospectus for the company, Morrell made his case for investing in his idea for an airship called the Ariel. The San Francisco Examiner explained in October of that year. Morrell proposed to put in commission an airship which will be capable of carrying 500 passengers and 40 tons of mail from New York to London in a 24-hour trip. The website Then and Now writes, the prospectus called for landing docks on the tops of office buildings in all the large cities of the world and stated that his airships would earn over $25,000 a day.
It was an ambitious plan. The Ariel was to be 1,250 feet long. In Germany, Count von Hindenburg's largest airship, the L-3, was just 414 feet. In fact, the Ariel was to be about a third longer than the Hindenburg, which wouldn't be built for another 28 years.
But Morrell believed that he had identified the secret: hollow aluminum tubes. Worldwide magazine wrote in 1908, the chairs in this remarkable craft would be made of hollow aluminum tubes and weigh only 17 ounces. The bedsteads of the same material weighing 27 ounces. The ship, the magazine writes, was intended to make regular trips between San Francisco and New York City, carrying passengers as comfortably as a Pullman car. As the Ariel was supposedly under construction, Morrell produced an experimental craft intended to bolster faith in the company for which he was seeking funds. Built in San Francisco, the experimental ship was a marvel in itself. 630 feet long and 36 feet in diameter, it was possibly the largest airship ever built to that time, certainly the largest ever built in the United States. In preparation for a test flight on October 1st, the San Francisco Examiner writes, Mr. Morrell had fitted the huge balloon with gas, converting it from a flapping bag of helpless canvas into a struggling gigantic thing of titanic strength. But things don't always go as planned when you're on the cutting edge of technology. The Examiner goes on. Mr. Morrell has long and eagerly awaited a trial trip with his airship. Yesterday, with his crew of 10 men, he filled the vessel with gas and allowed it, after ballasting with over 5,000 pounds in brick and sand, to rise to a height of about 300 feet, securely anchored by 1.5-inch ropes at the bow and stern. Slackening on the bow rope to right it, the enormous bag thus released at one end jumped suddenly upward and snapped the stern anchor rope, pulling away from the snub rope at the bow. Then it shot upward. Morrell's gas bag was suddenly loose. The Stockton, California Evening Mail reported, in the city, crowds obstructed the street corners, viewing with amusement or horror the masterless aerial vessel. Reports came that there were men on board, that the huge ship had become unmanageable, that the fearless sailors were doomed to a horrible death, but no one was on it. The Examiner described the adventure. The powerful monster careened and tossed its upward flight, seemingly striving for mastery with the rushing air currents. In the grasp of the wind, it struggled for supremacy, and then, vanquished, was carried across the heavens. The spectacle drew quite the crowd. The Examiner continued, every house added its quota to the pursuing crowd, all eager to be in at the death. At Redwood, fresh cohorts took the trail and, heartened by the evident exhausted state of the runaway airship, pressed on with intense enthusiasm, walking, running, in automobiles, carriages of all description, astride a horse or bicycle. The unique army sped on. But the adventure couldn't last. Fair Oaks witnessed the end. Getting too near the oaks there, the immense bag was caught by a dozen branches. It swelled against them, becoming still more entangled, and then, in the struggle for freedom, tore in a score of places, collapsing like a dish rag.
What was left was mostly, according to the Examiner, carried away by the following crowds as souvenirs. You might think that Mr. Morrell would be disheartened that his first balloon wound up as a dish rag, but according to the Examiner, he was not discouraged. Why, I feel badly when I think of the setback that we received, he told an Examiner reporter. I cannot but be elated at the way that the ship behaved. She has proven that she was built on solid plans. While the only thought of all of us as she floated away was, if only We were on board.
Undeterred, Morrell continued to market his company. A January 7th edition of the Los Angeles Evening Post Record writes that Morrell confidently declares that it is the Airship, and not the corporation, that will go up. The newspaper continues. The balloon is shaped like a huge projectile made to split the air at a 2.5 miles a minute clip. The inventor, in all confidence, declares that aerial navigation is solved, and that before the middle of next year he will be dispensing tickets for airship tours from San Francisco to New York. Apparently, Morrell's company had found success, as the Evening Post Record notes, up to last June, 183,339 shares had been sold. It's not surprising, given the adventure in October, that San Francisco was not as confident as Mr. Morrell. San Francisco Fire Chief Patrick Shaughnessy refused to allow a permit to test the bag, which would be filled with flammable natural gas from the municipal system. Undaunted, Morrell moved the test to Berkeley. There, the Oakland Tribune noted, Fire Chief James Kinney was opposed to permitting the ascent for fear that, in falling, the machine might crash into a house or by an explosion start a serious conflagration. But he told the newspaper, I did not want to interfere as long as no formal complaints were made. Chief Shaughnessy told me that he had refused to permit the test of such a machine in San Francisco, but had I interfered, somebody here would have raised a protest and charged that I was seeking to interfere with a legitimate enterprise. For his part, Morrell was disappointed at San Francisco's lack of vision. He told the Berkeley Gazette, if San Francisco had accorded me the treatment I've received in Berkeley, successful aerial navigation would have been a reality a year ago, instead of a probability that is doubted by many at the present time. Of the work in Berkeley, the Gazette wrote on May 6th, the Morrell Airship Company is constructing a monster airship in the city, the progress of which will be watched with interest. A lot back of the high school building and extending from Millville Street to Grove has been selected as the site of the enormous vessel that will be constructed to soar the dizzy heights. About 50 men are working like nailers to complete the craft, and the busiest man in the force is J.A. Morrell, inventor of the ship. He is here, there, and everywhere on the job, watching to see that his instructions are carried out in the minutest detail.
The airship was of a type that would come to be called semi-rigid. The gas bag had no internal structure, but the entire long balloon had a strong keel that was made of woven hemp.
The craft was described in the Oakland Tribune. The ship is a huge cylindrical affair, 450 feet long with a diameter of 36 feet. When filled with gas, it will have a lifting capacity of 14 tons, while the dead weight of the engines, canvas bag, and men to operate it will not exceed to 5 tons. Morrell says that his ship is a combination of an aeroplane and a gas balloon. Below the huge canvas filled with gas will be a keel upon which will be mounted 5 60-horsepower automobile gasoline engines. These engines will be 60 feet apart, and each will operate a propeller and combination aeroplane. In this manner, the big car can be driven at will, with the man directing the flight from a steering gear in the rear. There will be an engineer for each engine ensconced in the seat directly behind. And the speed of the aeroplane or propellers will thus be under the control of the engineers, who will act on signals from the director of the flight. The flight would carry 15 people, including spaces for photographers and invited guests. The number was described as by far the most to have ever ridden a balloon at the time. On May 18th, the Gazette wrote, everyone is anxiously awaiting the trial of the Morrell airship, which is being constructed in the lot on Kittredge Street between Millville and Grove Street. This is one of the largest airships in the world, being over 400 feet in length, and has been built along entirely different lines than any former experiment.
But there was reason to be concerned, and not just because of the fiasco from the previous October.
The Gazette noted, there is a diversion of opinion as to the safety of the craft. The builder, J.A. Morrell, having every confidence in his invention, while Colonel F.A. Postnikoff of 1828 Delaware Street questions the quality of the material used to confine the gas in the enormous bag. The colonel was no idle speculator. The Gazette explains, Colonel Postnikoff is an expert in aerial craft. He was an officer in the Russian army during the Russo-Japanese War and was in charge of the Tsar's war balloons at Vladivostok. He told the paper, I am very much interested in the construction of the big ship that is being built in the city and have made a careful examination of it. I believe that the builder, Mr. Morrell, is a deep thinker and a first-class machinist, but it requires more than a knowledge of mechanics to build any kind of an aerial craft successfully. One must be familiar with the physics as well, and I am anxious that nothing in my remarks shall be construed to discourage anyone who is trying to solve the question of aerial navigation. But as a student of these things, I feel that the ship Mr. Morrell is building is unsafe. Morrell, for his part, was confident as ever. I came to Berkeley to build my ship for trial purposes, to train my crew and demonstrate to the world that my theory is right, he told the Gazette. All that I ask at the present time is for the interested ones, as well as those who are doubtful, to wait and see for themselves.
And both the doubtful and the interested would have a chance to see if he was right on May 23rd, 1908, 114 years ago, today.
The interested were many. The Examiner wrote, "For 3 days, the region about Kittredge and Grove Street, where the airship was being prepared and made ready for the flight, has been haunted by curious people. Late Friday night, it was announced on the streets the Morrell would essay an ascension yesterday morning, and people were assembled as early as 3 in the morning. It was 6 hours later when Morrell made the definite statement that a flight would be made, and thousands had gathered by that time. When the great bag began to fill with gas pumped from a nearby main, the excitement of the spectators was keen. The crowd increased until a few minutes before the start, the streets were blocked for 3 squares away." The Oakland Tribune described the launch. There was a preliminary test of the engines, and Morrell dropped his hat from his seat to straddle the hempen keel near the front of the ship, and the signal to start. The signal was apparently misunderstood, and one of the anchormen tipped the airship forward. It was when the most elevated part of the airship had risen about 300 feet that the first warning of disaster was received. The middle of the gas holder was seen to wrinkle, thus interfering with the even flow of the gas. Aeronaut Ben Taylor, who had been denied a spot by Morrell but stowed away last minute, taking the total number aboard to 16, told the Tribune, "The ascension was a good one, but soon after we were up on one end. The bag began to tip. I looked at Morrell and saw him make his way through the machinery toward the higher end. He cried, 'This way, boys!' His idea was to weigh down that end and thus allow us to go down evenly. At that time, the machine was going down with a rush. I tried to follow him, but before I knew it, the machine hit the ground." The Chicago Tribune wrote, 300 feet above a crowd of 10,000 persons, gay one moment, dumb with horror the next, and screaming in panic, the huge Morrell airship, the largest in the world, tipped, split, and burst, tumbling like a bullet-stricken bird and dashing its human freight to agony and injury against the earth. The Oakland Tribune wrote, "In one immense mass, the great balloon and its attendants fell, covering a space almost equal to a city block, and pinioning beneath the wreckage the men who had undertaken to make the flight. Some were almost smothered by the escaping gas, while others suffered broken limbs and internal injuries of a serious nature." And the risk was not just to the aeronauts caught in the wreckage. The Oakland Tribune lamented. There was a horrifying medley of shouts and shrieks from the thousands of people clustered about. For a moment it seemed the ship and its weight of engines, men, and torn canvas would fall directly into the mass of women and children that crowded every available inch of space about the corner of Milva and Kittredge Streets. The air was full of cries of terror. Men began to fight for space to move, and women fainted. Finally, the once great vessel for which Mr. Morrell had such high hopes was again the victim of the mob. The Oakland Tribune writes, "After the wounded had been removed and the crowd had recovered from the horror, there was a rush of souvenir hunters, and all sorts of vandalism was committed." By May 25th, the Berkeley Gazette wrote, "A few pieces of scrap iron and remnants of canvas are all that remains of the monster Morrell airship, which had been such an object of interest to scores of visitors at Kittredge, Milva, and Grove Streets for the last month, and the initial flight of which, on Saturday, proved so disastrous."
And yet, almost miraculously, what has been described as America's first dirigible disaster didn't kill a single person, although all 16 men on board suffered injuries of varying severity. Morrell himself suffered a broken leg.
The failure should not have been a surprise. Aeronautics magazine noted in June that the company had been under investigation since March. Referring to his claims on the company prospectus, they called Morrell the world's most prolific liar. Worldwide magazine said of the balloon design, nearly every well-known principle of airship construction was violated. Alexander Graham Bell declared that the balloon should have used ballast for a test rather than risking so many people. By May 25th, the Berkeley Gazette was reporting that Morrell was being sued by stockholders, the largest of which was suspected to be his girlfriend.
History is full of those stories of those who persevered, even when those around them were telling them that they were overly optimistic, perhaps downright crazy. And we love to tell the stories of those who beat the odds, proved the naysayers wrong, saw a future that others could not. History, ironically, doesn't seem to remember nearly as well those times when it was the naysayers who got it right. But perhaps Mr. Morrell was, in fact, a visionary ahead of his time. I mean, after all, the crash of the magnificent Morrell airship beat the Hindenburg by nearly 3 decades. Oh, the humanity. We live in an era where air travel is common. According to the International Civil Aviation Organization, 3.5 billion passengers rode on scheduled air service in 2015. And if you have ridden on an aircraft, it was almost certainly a heavier-than-air aircraft, as the alternative, lighter-than-air air travel, is pretty much only relegated to a few leisure pursuits these days. But that was not always the case. There was a period when the great airships competed with airplanes for dominance of the skies. And the pinnacle of that competition might well have been a race in 1926 between two of the world's greatest explorers. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In general, aircraft come in two categories. A lighter-than-air aircraft, or aerostat, works by the principle of buoyancy. The average density of the craft is lower than the density of atmospheric air, and so rises. Essentially, a bag filled with gas that is less dense than air produces lift. The alternative, aerodynes, fly due to aerodynamic lift, which requires movement of a wing surface through an air mass. The first documented use of an aerostat to carry a human pilot came in 1783, when French brothers Joseph and Jacques Montgolfier created a globe-shaped balloon, filled it with hot air, and first demonstrated its use in Paris on June 4th. Another Frenchman, inventor Jacques Charles, piloted a balloon filled with hydrogen gas that December. The concept was so radical that when one of his early test projects crashed in the countryside, terrified peasants attacked it with pitchforks. The same month, yet another French inventor, Jean-Baptiste Musnet, presented a design to the French Academy of Sciences for a practical airship that could be steered and was powered using propellers. In 1784, a craft built on his design traveled more than 100 kilometers. By 1900, the famous German Count von Zeppelin built a practical aerostat airship that could cover great distances at a top speed of 27 kilometers per hour. As for aerodynes, British scientist George Cayley described the principles of aerodynamic lift in 1809, and the first glider to use the principles to carry an adult human pilot was flown in 1853. The first machine-powered aerodyne was demonstrated by American inventors Orville and Wilbur Wright in 1904. Prior to the First World War, you could say the technologies competed. The first passenger airship service began in Germany in 1910, and the first passenger airplane service began in the United States in Florida in 1914, using a flying boat. At that point, the airships had an advantage, carrying far more passengers greater distances, but neither was a particularly common mode of transportation. Both technologies were heavily utilized by militaries in the Great War, with airplane technology particularly developing during the war. The competition between airship and airplane, however, was not answered, and in the 1920s took on a particular importance in terms of polar exploration. The period of the end of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century included what was called the heroic age of polar exploration. Explorers from a number of nations went to explore the most hostile and least understood environments on Earth in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. This was called the heroic age because technology was limited, conditions were primitive, and the exploration was extremely dangerous and very often deadly. These explorers risked their lives in scientific pursuits, putting their lives on the line for the betterment of the world. These explorations made huge contributions to science, but national prestige was also on the line. Scientific discoveries and firsts represented national honor, and nations sought as a way to prove themselves on the international stage. One of the most significant of these contests was the race to get to the poles. Despite little real scientific value in reaching the magnetic North and South poles, they represented the pinnacle of remote exploration at the time, and for the first time, seemed to be within reach. Being the first to reach one of the poles would gain an explorer international fame. Norwegian Roald Amundsen was one of the legendary explorers of the heroic age. Born into a family of Norwegian shipbuilders in 1872, he had been inspired by explorers of the 1880s. Between 1910 and 1912, Amundsen led the first expedition to reach the South Pole, using sled dogs and arriving at the South Pole on December 14, 1911, 5 weeks ahead of a rival team led by British explorer Robert Falcon Scott, who died on his return trip. But it was during the 1920s, most historians note the 1920-21 Quest expedition where the great explorer Ernest Shackleton died, that we shifted from the heroic age of polar exploration to the mechanical age of polar exploration. During the mechanical age, new technologies, things like airplanes and automobiles, changed the methods of polar exploration. Now it was not just a test of humanity, it was also a test of technology, testing the durability and reliability of new machines and potentially meaning a fortune for the companies that produce those machines. And the first great race of the mechanical age of polar exploration, the race to be the first to overfly the North Pole, involved two of the world's greatest explorers. Born in Virginia in 1888, Richard E. Byrd was the quintessential example of the mechanical age of exploration. A pilot with the U.S. Navy during the First World War, he had planned the flight path for the first Atlantic crossing by air, done by the U.S. Navy in Curtiss flying boats. In 1925, he had commanded the aviation unit of an expedition to the north of Greenland, and had become convinced of the value of aircraft in Arctic exploration. In 1925, Roald Amundsen had tried to fly to the North Pole using flying boats. When one was damaged during a landing, he and his crew had barely made it out with their lives. He became convinced that the best possibility to cross the pole by air was to use an airship, and planned an expedition for 1926. The same year, Richard Byrd, then a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, had become determined to fly to the pole in an airplane. It was now a race between Roald Amundsen and Richard Byrd. It was also a race between aerostat and aerodyne. While an airplane was faster, as Amundsen learned in his attempt in 1925, if anything went wrong, they had to set down right away. Not always possible in the Arctic, and taking off again might be impossible. An airship, while slower, could repair its engines in flight if need be. Airships also carried more weight. Amundsen signed a contract with Italian airship designer Umberto Nobile to use his semi-rigid airship, then called the N1. The N1 was 347 feet 9 inches long and 85 feet 4 inches in diameter, and powered by three six-cylinder engines. It did not have an internal structure like a German Zeppelin. Rather, the pressurized envelope was reinforced by metal frames at the nose and the tail, with a flexible, tubular metal keel connecting the two. The N1 was officially sold to the Aero Club of Norway, which was financing the expedition, modified for cold conditions, and renamed the Norge, meaning the Norway. A wealthy American explorer named Lincoln Ellsworth also helped to finance the expedition and accompanied Amundsen and Nobile on the trip. After several weather delays and a wait to build a docking tower at their jumping-off point on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen, they finally arrived in April of 1926. For his flight, Byrd decided to use a three-engine monoplane built by the Dutch airplane manufacturer Fokker. The Fokker F-7, commonly called the Fokker Trimotor, was one of the most popular passenger aircraft of the 1920s. Byrd needed financing, so had named the plane Josephine Ford, after automobile manufacturer Edsel Ford's daughter, in order to procure a donation from Ford to fund the trip. When Byrd's ship, carrying the Josephine Ford, steamed through Kings Bay on the island of Spitzberg, he found that the only space at the dock was already occupied by Amundsen's ship. Unable to dock, Byrd was forced to lash the ship's lifeboats together to carry his airplane to shore. Byrd made his attempt, accompanied by pilot Floyd Bennett, on May 9th. No one had ever taken off using the Fokker Trimotor on skis before, and it took 3 attempts to take off. 8 hours in, one of the engines started leaking oil. Bennett wanted to sit down and try to fix the problem, but the ice below was broken, with no place to land. Byrd decided to press on, as they were only an hour from the pole. At just over 9 hours in, they reached the North Pole, winning the race. The return was dicey given the oil leak, but the plane was lighter as it had burned so much fuel and made it back to Spitsbergen. Byrd returned to international acclaim, and the United States awarded him the Medal of Honor. The Norge made its trip 2 days later, leaving May 11th and reaching the pole on the 12th, 3 days after Byrd. As they crossed the pole, Amundsen, Ellsworth, and Nobile each threw out their nation's flag to land on the pole. Relations were already strained between Amundsen and Nobile, and Amundsen became even more annoyed as Nobile deliberately threw out an Italian flag larger than the other two. The Norge landed in Alaska on May 14th. While Byrd had beaten them to the pole, the Norge was the first to fly over the ice cap between Europe and North America, making the voyage important to the understanding of the nature of the ice cap and its geography. But of course there was a twist. Almost immediately there were questions whether Byrd's calculations were correct, and arguing that, given the plane's airspeed, it must have come short of the pole. The controversy became even more heated in 1996, when Byrd's diary was released and showed erased but still legible sextant recordings that differ from his official report. The controversy rages on today. But if Byrd did not reach the pole, then the Norge may not just have been the first aircraft to fly over the pole, but as there are also questions as to whether the two 1909 land expeditions that purported to reach the North Pole had actually measured correctly. The Norge and Roald Amundsen may, in fact, have been the first explorers ever to reach the North Pole. Byrd went on to become the first person to fly over the South Pole in 1929. He became an admiral, and in World War II was a special advisor to Chief of Naval Operations Ernest King. He was present for the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, and helped to establish permanent Antarctic bases in the 1940s and 50s. He died of a heart ailment in 1957 at the age of 68. For a while, airships competed against airplanes and ocean liners for passenger service, but they lost their appeal after the spectacular explosion of the Graf Zeppelin Hindenburg in 1937. While airships can use helium, which is not flammable, rather than highly inflammable hydrogen, helium is expensive and hard to produce. Some airships were used for anti-submarine operations during the Second World War, but today they only play a few roles for such things as advertising, sightseeing, and some research. And fate played a strange trick on Umberto Nobili and Roald Amundsen. Nobili built another airship, which he named the Italia, or the Italy, and in 1928 planned an all-Italian expedition to the North Pole. They reached the pole on May 24th, but on the following day, in a gale, the Italia struck jagged ice and was destroyed. In all, 8 crew members died. It took 2 months to rescue the survivors, and in that, another tragedy. Roald Amundsen, being one of the world's most experienced Arctic explorers, was called in to assist in the search. On June 18, 1928, while searching for survivors of the Italia, the airplane carrying Roald Amundsen and 5 other crew members disappeared without a trace. It was never found. Roald Amundsen was 55 years old. Umberto Nobili survived the wreck of the Italia. He passed away in 1978 at the age of 93, the last survivor of the great race to overfly the pole in 1926, the pinnacle of the golden age of competition between aerostat and aerodyne, an age that deserves to be remembered. Today is September 4th, 2018, and it is an auspicious day because 95 years ago on this date, the United States made a great leap forward in aviation history with the maiden voyage of the ZR-1, America's first American-built rigid airship. The ZR-1 was a marvel of modern technology and absolutely unique among airships in the world at the time, and it represents that brief and spectacular era when behemoths of the sky floated majestically around the world. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On a chilly night, October 19, 1917, 11 German Zeppelins took off from their bases, planning what was one of the largest bombing raids of the era. The raid was expected to be 25 hours long, demonstrating the significant endurance advantage that airships had over aircraft at the time. The Zeppelins were meant to attack London, part of a mission to attack the British homeland in the hopes of forcing British aircraft to be redeployed away from attacking German bases and to terrify the British population. The German Zeppelin raids over London were particularly terrifying as the nearly silent airships were nearly invisible at night, and night flying was particularly dangerous for aircraft at the time. Although they were attacked by British anti-aircraft guns, they managed to drop all their bombs. 36 people were killed in the raid and 55 were injured. A single 300-pound bomb from Zeppelin L-45 fell at Glenview Road, Hither Green, London, destroying 3 houses and damaging many others. 5 women and 9 children were killed, including 7 siblings of the Kingston family between the ages of 3 and 18. It was the last bomb dropped on London by a Zeppelin. But that night, the Allies would get their revenge. While returning to the base, the airships ran into strong headwinds and heavy fog, and in the confusion, 8 of the 11 wandered over Allied territory in France. 2 were destroyed by Allied anti-aircraft, and 2 were attacked by French aircraft. Both were forced down. One of those, the Zeppelin L-49, was forced to land, realizing as the tracer bullets from the French Spads flew by that they could not escape, and that a hit from one of those rounds would cause their hydrogen-filled airship to explode. The crew hung out a white flag, and the French pilots directed them to land near Bourbon-le-Bain in northeastern France. Before the French pilots could land, the German commander destroyed the craft's wireless. He tried to set the airship on fire, but was stopped by a local man. 21 German crew were taken prisoner. But more than that, the L-49 was landed undamaged. It was the first German airship to be captured intact. The L-49 was studied and reverse engineered. The U.S. intended to use the design of the L-49 as the basis for the first American-built rigid airship, but to show the danger of traveling in those airships at the time, the U.S. design was influenced by the crashes of 2 other airships. The British had used the information garnered from the study of the L-49 to help design their own class of airship, the R-38. Initially, 4 airships of the class were to be built, but 3 of the orders were cancelled as the armistice ended the war. The R-38 was also cancelled while under construction due to budget constraints, but the United States expressed interest and the airship was purchased and completed. At the time, it was the largest airship in the world. The plan was to do some 50 hours of flight testing to test the airship and train its U.S. crew. On August 27, 1921, while being tested in northeast England, the structure of the airship collapsed amidships. Witnesses said both ends drooped, followed by a fire, and then an explosion. 28 Britons and 16 Americans died in the crash. The L-49 was of a special design, the U-class, called a height climber. The design had been made to maximize the ability to climb, making the Zeppelin safer from anti-aircraft fire. But that required reducing the weight by weakening the structure. The inquest over the crash of the R-38 found that the structure was not able to manage the stresses of maneuvering and had not incorporated new features of airship design that allowed a stronger structure. The U.S. took these lessons to heart. Unlike the L-49 and the R-38, the Roma was a semi-rigid airship. Rather than having a full internal structure, such airships are built around a rigid keel. The Roma was designed and built in Italy and purchased by the United States in 1921. It was, at the time, the largest semi-rigid airship in the world. But disaster struck in February of 1922. The airship's box steering system failed during a test flight, and the ship swung around where it hit high-voltage wires. Filled with flammable hydrogen gas, the Roma burst into flames. 34 of the airship's crew were killed. And so when the first American-built rigid airship was laid down on June 24, 1922, based very much on the German L-49, it incorporated a number of structural improvements which was supposed to help it avoid the fate of the British R-38. And to avoid the fate of the Roma, the Americans decided that they would use the rare, expensive, but non-flammable gas helium as the lifting gas rather than hydrogen. The construction of the airship, originally called the ZR-1, was quite a feat of engineering. It was to be 680 feet long, more than 100 feet longer than the battleship USS Texas. It was to be assembled in the newly constructed Hangar 1 at Naval Air Station Lakehurst in New Jersey. Hangar 1, at 966 feet long, was at the time the world's record holder as the single largest room in the world. The structure was made out of duralumin, a type of age-hardened aluminum alloy, and manufactured at the U.S. Naval Aircraft Factory at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The parts were then transported by truck and rail to Lakehurst for assembly. The first ring for the structure arrived April 22, 1922, and was more than 78 feet across. Rings were connected together with longitudinal girders. Tension wires added strength and stability. Inside, there was room for 20 gas cells, which would hold the liquid gas. The gas cells were made of rubberized cotton lined with gold beater skin, which was taken from the outer membranes of the intestines of cattle, and was one of the most gas-impervious materials known at the time. While helium has the advantage of not being explosive, the use of helium offered some unique challenges. For example, as an airship expends fuel for its engines, it becomes lighter, causing the airship to rise. To maintain neutral buoyancy, a hydrogen airship would simply release some hydrogen gas, as hydrogen is cheap and easy to produce. But helium was expensive and rare, too expensive to merely vent into the atmosphere. In fact, filling up the airship consumed a significant portion of the entire world's helium reserves. The ZR-1 instead had a system that condensed and collected water vapor from the engines, which counterbalanced the weight lost as the ship burned fuel. The frame was then covered with high-grade cotton fabric, laced tightly into place over the entire hull and given several coats of dope, which shrunk the material tight against the framework. The final coat was mixed with aluminum powder to provide a smooth, weather-resistant skin, which also reflected the sun's heat away from the lifting gas. The airship was launched on August 20th, 1923, which means that still inside the hangar it was removed from its shorings and floating free. On September 4th, 95 years ago today, some 15,000 people watched as 420 sailors and Marines walked the ZR-1 out of Hangar 1 for the first time, and using 4 of her 6 300-horsepower, 8-cylinder Packard gasoline engines, lifted off the field with 29 people on board. It was the world's first ever flight of a helium-inflated, rigid airship. The ZR-1 remained aloft for 55 minutes. The ZR-1 underwent a number of trials over the next month, flying as far as St. Louis for the 1923 St. Louis air races. The flight went without a hitch, but the airship was yet to be tested for its value to the fleet. The ship was christened in a ceremony on October 10th. The Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Demby's wife, Marion, did the honors, christening the ship the USS Shenandoah, named after the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. The word Shenandoah was derived from a Native American word for the river, which some translate as beautiful daughter of the stars. The ship was commissioned the same day, under the command of Navy Commander Frank McCrary. The Shenandoah met its first great challenge in January of 1924. The ship had been working on mooring with the giant Lakehurst mooring mast. The mooring mast was a technological marvel in itself at over 160 feet tall, with an elevator, communication systems, electric lighting, and piping for gasoline, oil, helium, and water ballast. Once moored, the crew could exit the airship via a gangway from the nose. A mooring tower offered certain advantages over a hangar and avoided the difficult process of docking. Moreover, on long trips, hangars would not always be available. The Navy had talked about using the Shenandoah for Arctic research. On such a trip, docking facilities would be unavailable and mooring towers would have to be used for resupply. But mooring was a difficult process and took quite a lot of practice and testing. On January 14th, the Weather Service issued a warning about gale force winds. Rather than dock the Shenandoah ahead of the storm, the Navy decided to leave it moored to the mooring station to test the mooring. That turned out to be a mistake. A gust of nearly 80 miles per hour struck, collapsing the top fin and rolling the ship over. That twisted the nose cone attached to the mooring tower off, and the crippled Shenandoah was off for an exciting ride. The forward gas cells deflated and the airship pitched forward. A crash might have destroyed the Shenandoah, but the crew jettisoned ballast and ordered the crew members aft to right the ship. The ship careened across the field, nose still down, narrowly missing the treetops. The engines were started and the crew slowly regained control, shifting ballast and fuel until the Shenandoah was righted. The damaged ship rode ahead of the storm, finishing 50 miles away in Newark. Following the storm, the ship had to be nursed back, difficult to control without a nose and with its twisted top fin. But the Shenandoah had survived the worst January storm in the area in decades. President Coolidge sent a telegram of congratulations. After repairs, the Shenandoah began testing for practical application with the Navy, demonstrating that an airship could be valuable in the scouting role. A Navy oiler, the USS Patoka, was fitted with a mooring mast and specially modified as an airship tender. In October, the Shenandoah flew across the nation, from Lakehurst to San Diego, up to Washington and back, testing newly built mooring towers. It was the first rigid airship to cross North America. In 1924, the ship was laid up for repairs and modifications. Helium was so scarce that some of Shenandoah's helium was needed to inflate the new airship, USS Los Angeles. During the process, the ship's captain, Zachary Lansdowne, had 10 of the ship's automatic gas valves removed. The decision saved several hundred pounds in weight, and it limited the release of expensive helium gas, but it came at a price. As an airship rises, the gas inside the gas bags expands, and the pressure valves are there to release gas so that the gas bags don't expand to the point where they damage the airship's structure. By removing 10 of the Shenandoah's 18 automatic gas valve releases, Captain Lansdowne had limited the ability of the Shenandoah to gain altitude quickly, because if it rose too quickly, the gas valves that were less could not keep up with the expansion of the gas. In September, the ship left for a promotional tour of the Midwest, with a plan to visit state fairs and fly over Midwest cities. The trip was a risk. The thunderstorm season could be brutal in the Midwest. Commander Lansdowne argued that the trip should be canceled or at least postponed past mid-September when the season usually subsided. But his superiors would only allow the trip to be postponed until September 3rd, when the Shenandoah was expected to make a visit to the Ohio State Fair. On September 3rd, the airship was over Ohio when it hit a storm cell. Spectators described the ship as being tossed around like a bobber, at one point nearly standing on end. Convective updrafts lifted it as fast as 1,000 feet per minute, more than the remaining valve releases could handle. The Shenandoah broke in two, the aft section plummeting, killing the engineers in the section. The control car broke loose and dropped to the ground, killing the men inside, including Commander Lansdowne. 7 men in the bow managed to get enough control to release gases and free balloon to a soft landing. In all, 14 members of the Shenandoah's crew died in the accident. After the accident, many people blamed the Army and the Navy for ignoring Commander Lansdowne's warnings about the weather. Airships were really only built to be flown in good weather, and they are at particular risk over land where there can be violent updrafts. Aviator Billy Mitchell's criticism was so strong, essentially arguing that public relations had overcome safety, that he was court-martialed for his criticism and his career was ruined. But other people blamed Commander Lansdowne for the removal of the gas pressure valves. In a sorry display, spectators at the scene took away souvenirs, heedless of the aviators' deaths. The farmer upon whose land the ship had crashed charged visitors by the carload to visit the site. Today, various memorials mark the locations of the wreckage and memorialize the crash. As a result of the inquiry, the military decided to strengthen the internal structure of its remaining airships and decided to start paying more official attention to weather forecasting, but in the end, the airships just turned out to be unsafe. Of America's 4 rigid airships, only one, the USS Los Angeles, made it all the way to retirement. In 1933, the USS Akron was destroyed in a storm at sea and 73 people died. 2 years after that, its sister ship, the USS Macon, was destroyed in another storm at sea and 2 people died. And 2 years after that, the Hindenburg exploded as it was trying to land at Naval Air Station Lakehurst. The accidents put an end to the era of the common use of rigid airships. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop and book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.